The morning of March 2, 1998, started like any other for 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch. The streets of Vienna were still waking up, the air crisp, the light gray. She clutched her red school bag tightly against her chest, her small boots making quick taps along the pavement as she hurried toward school. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, just math lessons, playground laughter, and the promise of her mother picking her up later. But somewhere between the corner store and the quiet stretch of Rennbahnweg, everything changed. A white minivan slowed beside her. The driver, a man in his mid-30s, leaned over, pretending to check something on the passenger seat. He spoke softly, asking for directions. Natascha hesitated. Something about him, his pale face, his expression too calm, made her uneasy. Before she could step back, he lunged forward, yanked open the sliding door, and pulled her inside. The world went black. She kicked, screamed, and tried to bite his arm, but his grip was iron strong. He held a hand over her mouth, muffling her cries. The van accelerated down side streets, through back roads, until the sound of the city faded completely. She felt every turn, every bump of the tires. The man said nothing. Only the sound of his breathing filled the space. After what felt like hours, the van stopped. He dragged her out, still gripping her wrist like a vice, and led her into a small house at the edge of Strasshof, a quiet suburb north of Vienna. The curtains were drawn, the air thick and still. He locked the door behind them. Then he pushed aside a rug in the corner of a room and revealed something hidden, a hatch. Beneath it, a ladder descended into darkness. He told her to climb down. At the bottom was a narrow concrete tunnel that led to a small, windowless room, bare walls, a bed, a sink, a few shelves. It smelled of dampness and metal. This, he said, would be her new home. His name was Wolfgang Priklopil. He was her captor, and this was where her childhood would end. In the first days, she barely spoke. She cried until her throat burned, whispering for her mother, hoping someone would hear. But no one came. The walls were too thick. The soundproofing was perfect. Even the outside world didn't know this cellar existed. It was built beneath the garage, sealed behind layers of concrete, invisible to anyone above. Wolfgang kept her under strict control. She was not allowed to speak unless spoken to. She had to ask permission to use the toilet. The lights were turned off whenever he left, plunging her into total darkness for hours. He fed her meager portions of food, bread, soup, sometimes fruit, and watched her eat in silence. He didn't just want control over her body, he wanted control over her mind. He told her that no one was looking for her, that her parents didn't love her anymore, that the world believed she was dead. At first, she refused to believe it. But after weeks of silence, after endless nights alone in that airless room, even her memories began to blur. Days melted into months. She marked time in her head by small things: when her hair grew long enough to tie, when the calendar she scratched into the wall reached another row. She tried to remember what her school looked like, her mother's perfume, the color of the sky. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and imagine being older, free, walking outside again. It was the only thing that kept her sane, the vision of her future self standing in sunlight, telling this little girl that she survived. Wolfgang alternated between moments of calculated gentleness and bursts of cruelty. He would bring her small gifts, a book, a comb, and then punish her for speaking out of turn. He wanted her to depend on him completely. He told her he was her only friend, the only one who cared for her now. It was a twisted kind of grooming, one that blurred fear with forced gratitude. As time passed, Natascha began to study him. She noticed his habits, how he always checked the locks 3 times before leaving, how he cleaned obsessively, how he never let her see the upper floors of the house. She realized he was paranoid, afraid of being caught, and that fear was something she could use. Sometimes he'd take her upstairs for short moments when he needed her help, carrying groceries, cleaning, or fixing something. He would blindfold her first, leading her by the hand. The first time she felt sunlight touch her skin again after months underground, tears rolled silently down her face. But she didn't let him see her cry. She couldn't give him that satisfaction. Her world was defined by repetition, The same meals, the same walls, the same voice. But inside she began building another world, one where she was not a prisoner but a survivor. She made plans in her head, mental blueprints of the house from every sound she heard. She listened to the way footsteps echoed, memorized when the cars passed outside, when trains rumbled in the distance. Every noise was a clue, every pattern a piece of her escape. Years passed. She was no longer the little girl he had kidnapped. She was growing up in the shadows, her body changing, her voice deepening. He noticed, and his control grew tighter. He shaved her head once to keep her from feeling pretty, told her she didn't deserve to be seen by anyone. She endured it in silence. She knew that angering him too much could mean death. There were moments when she felt like giving up, when the loneliness pressed so hard she could barely breathe. But then she'd close her eyes and imagine her mother's face. In her dreams, her mother was always calling her name, never giving up. That image became her secret weapon. When Wolfgang would sit upstairs, listening to the radio or watching the news, Natascha would try to catch bits of it through the faint hum in the ceiling. That was how she learned the world was still moving on without her. New presidents, new songs, new stories. The passage of time became proof that her own story wasn't over yet. One day, she managed to leave a tiny scratch on the inside of the hatch door, her name, carved with a stolen nail. It was her way of saying I exist. No one might ever see it, but it gave her strength. Occasionally, he would talk about his life, about how he hated people, how the world had wronged him. He saw himself as a misunderstood genius, a man too smart for others to understand. He wanted her to admire him, to see him as her savior instead of her jailer, but she saw through it. She began to play along, nodding, agreeing, pretending to be grateful. It was the only way to earn his trust. Her small acts of resistance became her quiet rebellion. Sometimes she'd eat slower just to make him impatient. Sometimes she'd move an object slightly out of place so he'd question his own memory. They were dangerous games, but they gave her back a tiny sliver of control. As the years rolled on, the world outside changed seasons while she lived in eternal gray. Her sense of time dissolved completely. There were no calendars, no holidays, no birthdays, but deep inside she kept counting. Every day she survived was one day closer to freedom. By 2005, Natascha was 17. She had spent more than 7 years in captivity, over half her life. Her body was thin, her skin pale from lack of sunlight, but her mind was sharper than ever. Wolfgang began to allow her upstairs more often. He needed her help with chores, and he believed she had become obedient. He didn't realize that she was quietly observing every lock, every window latch, every possible exit. One day she overheard him talking about selling the house. The thought terrified her. If he moved, he might rebuild the cellar somewhere else, deeper, stronger. Or worse, he might kill her to erase all traces of his crime. She knew she was running out of time. That night she lay awake on her thin mattress, listening to the faint hum of electricity in the walls. She whispered to herself that she would escape. Not soon. Not maybe. She would. She didn't know how yet, but the certainty burned in her chest like a spark that refused to die. She imagined walking through her front door again, her mother crying, the flash of cameras, the sound of people saying her name out loud. She had no idea what awaited her outside, whether the world would even remember her, but she knew that staying silent any longer meant vanishing completely. And so quietly, patiently, she began preparing for her chance. The years had carved deep grooves in her mind, but not all of them were filled with despair. Some were lined with a strange kind of strength, the kind born only from surviving the impossible. For Natascha, life in that cellar had become a long negotiation between hope and obedience, rebellion and survival. She learned when to stay silent, when to act, and when to appear broken. It was the only way to make him trust her. Wolfgang Priklopil had changed too. The control that once made him confident had started to decay into paranoia. He watched her constantly, even when he pretended not to. He listened for whispers, for the sound of her moving differently, for signs she was planning something. But Natascha was careful. She hid her plans beneath layers of quiet routine, making sure that her every motion seemed harmless, rehearsed, loyal. There were moments when he treated her almost like an assistant instead of a prisoner. He would let her eat at the kitchen table, ask her to clean his clothes, even allow her to cook sometimes. She noticed how obsessive he was, how he cleaned the same spot twice, how he arranged his tools by size and color. He hated dirt, chaos, unpredictability. It gave her a clue about his mind. Everything had to be perfect, controlled, certain. If she wanted to escape, she had to make him believe she was predictable, until the one moment she was. By the 8th year, the house had become both her cage and her classroom. She knew every creak in the floorboards, every sound the locks made. She knew when the neighbors were home by the way the outside noise changed. She learned how far sound could travel from the yard when the garage door was open. Wolfgang, in his distorted way, believed he had made her part of his world. He often said that she was lucky to live with him, away from what he called the cruelty of society. He told her people out there were evil, that the world would hurt her. He said he had saved her from all that. Sometimes she almost pitied him, a man so twisted by loneliness that he created a world where he was the only ruler. But then she would remember the 10-year-old girl who had been dragged into that van, the years of humiliation, the stolen childhood. Pity turned into quiet rage. The cellar itself had changed over the years. He had added a few things, a small TV, some books, a new mattress. It looked less like a dungeon and more like a forgotten basement room. But to her, it would always smell like fear. Every object there held a memory, the lamp that had once gone dark for days, the blanket she had wrapped around herself when she was too afraid to sleep, the door she had stared at for years, waiting for it to open. Wolfgang's behavior grew stranger as time went on. He had few friends, almost no contact with family, and he rarely left the house for long. He worked as a technician, often taking his van out for short jobs, but even then he locked her in before leaving, checking every bolt. He feared the police, feared discovery, feared losing control, and yet he didn't see that his control was already slipping. In those rare moments when he allowed her outside under supervision within the fenced yard, Natascha would feel sunlight again. It was a shock every time. Her skin burned quickly, her eyes squinted, her body trembled with the forgotten warmth. Wolfgang would stand nearby, always alert, always ready to drag her back inside if anyone passed. But she watched everything. She studied the fence, the gate latch, the distance between the house and the street. She memorized the timing of neighborhood noises, when the trains passed, when the neighbor's lawnmower started, when schoolchildren walked by in the afternoons. She built an invisible map of the outside world in her mind, piece by piece. She began to understand that Wolfgang's control came from fear, not power. His entire life revolved around not being caught. That was his weakness. If she could create a moment when he was distracted, panicked, or unbalanced, she might have a chance. Still, it wasn't easy. There were days she felt trapped not just physically but mentally, when his voice filled every corner of her thoughts, when she caught herself repeating his words, believing his lies. Trauma does that. It blurs the line between prison and protection. One night during dinner upstairs, he asked her what she thought of him. The question froze her. She felt his eyes watching for the slightest hesitation. She answered softly, telling him that he had taken care of her, that she was grateful for everything he'd given her. It wasn't true, but it was what he needed to hear. He smiled, touched her hair, and said she was finally becoming part of his world. She smiled back, but inside she was already thinking of the day she would burn that world to ashes. That day came sooner than she expected. It was the morning of August 23, 2006. The air outside buzzed with the heat of late summer. Wolfgang was preparing to wash his car, one of his obsessive cleaning rituals. He told her to come with him to help with the vacuuming. She followed him into the driveway, her heart pounding. For once, he didn't lock the gate. Maybe he was distracted. Maybe he thought after 8 years she was too broken to run. He vacuumed the car interior while she cleaned the mats. The sun felt unreal on her skin. It had been so long since she'd stood under it freely. For a moment, she almost froze. Overwhelmed by the brightness, the scent of grass, the sounds of distant voices. Then something inside her snapped, a small, electric realization that this was the moment. When Wolfgang walked to the other side of the car to adjust the hose, she dropped the mat, straightened up and walked, not ran, not hesitated, straight toward the open gate. Every nerve in her body screamed that he would notice, that he'd grab her before she took 2 steps. But he didn't. She pushed the gate open. Then she ran. Her feet hit the gravel, her lungs filled with air she hadn't breathed in years. She sprinted down the street, not daring to look back. Behind her, she thought she heard a shout, his voice, distant, breaking apart in the summer air. She didn't stop. She ran past one house, then another, until she saw an elderly woman working in her garden. "Help me," she gasped. "I'm Natascha Kampusch." The woman froze, recognizing the name instantly, the missing girl who had vanished 8 years ago. She rushed Natascha inside and called the police. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. A girl thought to be dead for nearly a decade had escaped her captor. Police cars swarmed Strasshof, helicopters circled above. But by the time they reached Wolfgang's house, he was gone. He had fled the moment he realized she was gone. Later that evening, as officers tracked his movements through Vienna, he ended his life by stepping in front of a train. He never faced trial, never explained his motives, never gave anyone the chance to ask why. When the police entered the house, they found the cellar, the hidden room beneath the garage, sealed behind thick concrete. Inside were the fragments of a stolen childhood. Books, clothes, drawings, a small TV, a bed with a faded blanket. On the wall, scratched faintly into the paint, was her name. At the police station, Natascha sat in silence. She was 18 now, her face pale, her hair short. Reporters gathered outside, shouting her name, desperate for photos. But she barely heard them. Her mind was still half in that cellar. When her mother finally arrived, they embraced tightly, both crying, both shaking. The world around them blurred, flashing cameras, police voices, chaos, but that hug was real. After 3,096 days, Natascha Kampusch was free. Freedom, however, was not what she had imagined. The world she returned to was loud, fast, unfamiliar. Technology had changed, people had changed, and everyone wanted to know her story. Reporters followed her everywhere. Some called her a hero. Others accused her of sympathizing with her captor because she didn't express enough hatred. They couldn't understand that survival is not black and white, that when you live under someone's control for 8 years, the boundaries of fear and dependency twist in ways no outsider can imagine. She moved into a safe house first, under police protection. Every sound made her flinch, the slam of a door, the echo of footsteps. She had to learn everything again. How to use money, how to take the subway, how to live without permission. She had never finished school, never gone to a party, never chosen her own clothes. She was both an adult and a child at once. At night, she couldn't sleep without the light on. The darkness reminded her of the cellar. Even silence frightened her. She had lived too long listening for danger in every breath. She kept the TV on sometimes just to fill the emptiness. Psychologists worked with her, gently, helping her rebuild the pieces of her mind. But trauma isn't something that can be erased. It lives under the skin, in the way your heartbeat changes when someone closes a door too quickly. Despite it all, Natascha tried to move forward. She read books, studied languages, and began speaking publicly about resilience and survival. She wanted to show the world that she wasn't just the girl in the cellar. She was a person, one who had endured something unimaginable and still found a way to live. Over time, she even gained ownership of Wolfgang's house. It shocked many people, but she explained that it was her way of reclaiming what had been stolen from her. That house had been a symbol of captivity. Now it was a symbol of survival. She refused to let it be a museum for evil. Reporters continued to chase her for interviews, documentaries, books. Everyone wanted her story told in their words, but she wanted to tell it in her own. So she wrote a memoir, 3,096 Days, detailing her years in captivity, her mental strength, her escape. It wasn't written to shock or to sensationalize, but to help others understand what happens when someone's life is taken away and they have to rebuild it from nothing. Even then, not everyone understood. Some questioned her emotions, saying she didn't seem angry enough. Others claimed she had developed sympathy for her captor, a misinterpretation of trauma known as Stockholm Syndrome. But Natascha explained it clearly. She didn't forgive him, she didn't feel affection for him. She simply refused to let him own her feelings anymore. Hatred would only keep her tied to him. The years that followed were filled with slow healing. She traveled, she studied. She avoided fame as much as possible. She often said that freedom after captivity is not immediate joy. It's confusion, noise, guilt, and relearning how to exist in the world. She found solace in small things, walking alone at night without fear, feeling the wind, watching rain on windows. Those were miracles to her, proof that she was alive. When she revisited her childhood memories, they felt like distant dreams. The little girl who had walked to school that morning in 1998 was gone, but the woman she had become carried her within, the one who had survived every day of darkness and still found a way to hope. Sometimes, when she looked back, she remembered the cellar not as a place of total death, but as the place where she forged her strength, where a terrified child slowly learned how to outthink her captor, how to stay alive, how to believe in herself again. Her story wasn't about weakness, it was about endurance. She had spent 8 years in the shadows, and yet somehow she had walked back into the light. Freedom, Natascha would learn, isn't a single moment, it's a long, uneven path full of echoes from the past. In the first few months after her escape, the outside world felt almost unreal. The colors were too bright, the air too sharp, the noise of traffic almost unbearable. Everything she had once dreamed about, the streets, the crowds, the open sky, now frightened her. She had to remind herself that she was safe, that no one was going to lock her underground again. But her body didn't believe it yet. The police had given her a secure apartment in Vienna, while investigators combed through every inch of Wolfgang Priklopil's house. They found the hatch, the hidden room, the layers of cement and steel designed to trap her forever. It horrified the world, but to Natascha, it was just a structure she knew by touch and smell. The real prison had always been fear, and fear was much harder to tear down. Every morning, she woke up expecting to hear the metallic sound of the lock turning above her head. Sometimes she'd startle awake in the middle of the night, certain that he was standing by her bed. She would sit up, heart racing, until she realized she was alone. That realization always came with a strange mixture of relief and grief. Relief that he was gone, grief that her life would never be what it should have been. Doctors, therapists, journalists, everyone wanted something from her. They wanted to study her, to interview her, to ask how she'd survived. But how could she explain what survival meant when every breath she took was still tangled with the smell of that cellar, when her freedom still carried the shape of his shadow? Her mother tried to help, but their reunion was complicated. Time had carved 8 years between them, 8 birthdays missed, 8 Christmases, 8 years of fear and guilt. They cried together often, but even love couldn't fill the gap completely. Her mother wanted to protect her, yet didn't know how. Natascha needed space, quiet, control, all the things she'd been denied. They loved each other, but it took time to learn how to live together again. In those first months, Natascha spoke very little. Reporters camped outside her building, cameras waiting for a glimpse. Newspapers printed stories about her every day, some sympathetic, some cruel. They called her the girl in the cellar, as if her identity began and ended there. But she wasn't just that girl, she was a person rebuilding herself piece by piece. She started therapy sessions twice a week. The psychologist, a calm woman with soft eyes, never asked about the details of abuse directly. Instead, she asked how Natascha felt when she looked out a window, when she heard footsteps behind her, when she tried to sleep. Slowly, word by word, Natascha began to speak again about the fear, the isolation, the small rituals that had kept her sane. She explained how she used to imagine her older self visiting her in that cellar, a grown woman who told her that one day she would walk free. "That's how I survived," she said quietly. "I had to believe that future me existed." The therapist told her that what she'd done was an act of genius, the mind's way of protecting itself. But to Natascha, it didn't feel like genius. It felt like desperation, the only tool she'd had. As weeks turned into months, she began to explore the world again. Her first walk alone was terrifying. Every passing car made her flinch. Every man on the street looked like Wolfgang for a split second. But she kept walking. She forced herself to face the world she'd been denied for 8 years. She visited shops, parks, cafes, always with her heart pounding, always half expecting someone to drag her back. But each time she went out and came home safely, the fear loosened a little. Then came the questions, not from police or therapists, but from society. People wanted to understand how she could live so long under his control without trying to escape sooner. They didn't see that survival isn't about bravery, it's about calculation. Every attempt to resist could have meant death. She told her therapist once, "People think escape means running through an open door. But in that house, there were no open doors, only moments that looked like they might be." The investigation confirmed what she already knew. Wolfgang had planned her captivity meticulously. The cellar was soundproofed, insulated, hidden. No one in the neighborhood had any idea. The walls were so thick that even her screams couldn't reach outside. He had built his prison like a fortress of obsession, but also like a tomb. When his death was confirmed, she felt an emptiness she hadn't expected. She didn't mourn him, but his absence left a strange silence. For 8 years, his presence had defined every minute of her life, what she ate, when she spoke, when she slept. Without him, there was freedom, yes, but also a vast hollow space where fear used to be. People wanted her to express hatred. They wanted vengeance, outrage, tears for the cameras, but she refused to perform those emotions. She didn't owe anyone that. "He already took 8 years of my life," she once said. "I won't let him take my feelings too." She focused instead on rebuilding herself. She returned to studying, reading, and writing. She worked with professionals to reclaim her education. She loved languages, German, English, Russian, each one a doorway to a different world. She started painting, too, sometimes dark abstract shapes, sometimes bright flowers. Her art teacher said she painted like someone who had seen both hell and sunlight. By the second year after her escape, the world still hadn't stopped talking about her. Television networks wanted documentaries. Writers wanted book deals. Psychologists wanted to use her story in lectures. But she resisted being turned into a symbol. She didn't want to be a victim people pitied or a miracle people worshipped. She just wanted to be Natascha. When she finally agreed to write her own memoir, it was on her terms. She titled it 3,096 Days, the exact number of days she'd spent in captivity. Writing it was both torture and healing. Each word forced her to revisit the cellar, to relive the darkness she'd spent years trying to forget. But putting it on paper also gave her control. For the first time, she was the one telling the story, not the media, not the police, not the world. The book became an international success, but what mattered more to her was that it gave other survivors hope. Letters poured in from people who had endured their own traumas, abuse victims, former hostages, people struggling with fear. They told her courage helped them believe in their own. For the first time, she realized her pain could mean something more than suffering. It could be light for others. Still, there were setbacks. Some journalists twisted her words, painting her as strange, cold, or too forgiving. They accused her of Stockholm Syndrome, the idea that captives grow to care for their captors. She denied it firmly. "I was never in love with him," she said. "I was surviving. You learn to say what keeps you alive." But the public didn't always want complexity. They wanted a story with clear villains and victims. The truth was harder to digest. that survival can involve pretending to love the person you fear most, that sometimes kindness becomes a weapon. In private, Natascha worked hard to rebuild her sense of normalcy. She bought groceries by herself, traveled by train, started cooking her favorite foods. Small things became symbols of independence, choosing her own haircut, locking her own door, deciding when to turn the lights off. Years later, she made a decision that shocked many. She took ownership of Wolfgang's house. People couldn't understand why she would want to live anywhere near that place again. But for her, it was simple. "That house is part of my story," she said. "It doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to me." She transformed it quietly, room by room. The cellar remained sealed, but the rooms above were repainted, refurnished, filled with light. She planted flowers outside. What had once been a fortress of control became a symbol of reclamation. There were days when memories still haunted her, the click of a lock, the smell of concrete, the echo of his footsteps. But she learned to face them instead of running away. She told herself that remembering didn't mean she was still trapped. It meant she had survived. As the years passed, Natascha began to speak publicly about trauma and resilience. She appeared at conferences, schools, and international events, not as a victim, but as a voice for others who had endured the unthinkable. She spoke calmly, intelligently, sometimes even with humor, a sign that she had learned to hold her pain without letting it define her. People were struck not by her story but by her strength. She wasn't bitter, she wasn't broken. She was deliberate, thoughtful, determined. She talked about how trauma reshapes time, how captivity can last long after freedom begins, and how healing is not about forgetting, but integrating the past into the present. "I don't want to live in fear forever," she said in one interview. "If I hate him, then he still controls me. If I live, then I win." Those words echoed far beyond Austria. Survivors of violence across the world saw in her a mirror proof that it's possible to rebuild after the unimaginable. Over the next decade, she lived mostly quietly, avoiding tabloids and focusing on her own growth. She studied psychology, volunteered with youth organizations, and supported victims of abduction and abuse. She learned to drive.